So in fact, reflecting back on what you read previously or what you learned is a way of actually making it stick in your own mind and helping you create your own framework so that everybody can learn and apply these ideas to your own work. And so to help us with that, I thought that we could start just thinking about what we learnt in our module. So we're going to start with a fun quiz, and I hope everybody can see this. So my first question then is, we thought a bit about indicators, so I've got some questions for you here. Indicators should be, you've got answers A, B, C, or D, and you're welcome to put your answers in the chat box. So what should indicators be? A, B, C, or D? And you're also welcome to shout it out. Okay, yeah, we've got things coming in the chat box. Excellent. Brilliant. So indicators should be SMART. But actually, thinking of SMART, what actually does SMART mean? Does it mean A, B, C, or D? Excellent. Everyone is really on the ball here. We've got D. They're measurable and time bound. But we actually all know that the letters SMART mean more than that, don't they? So I thought I'd just have a quick recap on what we mean by SMART, and also maybe to ask you how useful you find that. So here's an example of an indicator for reduction in chimpanzee poaching. And so here you can see you've got, okay, they're specific. Remember, the S for SMART is specific. So they've decided that illegal snares were a specific indicator for chimpanzee poaching. And they're measurable. They're going to measure the number of snares per transect. So that was the M. They're achievable. So according to this project, reducing the number from 10 to 0 by 2018, they think is achievable. So they need to indicate it's achievable. Relevant. The indicator has to be relevant to your short-term impact. It has to be absolutely measuring what you say you're going to do. So that was the R. And then, of course, we all know the T is time-bound. But my piece of advice on indicators is people use SMART as a shorthand, but they don't always mean that you have to kind of go through it like this, because as you can see, there's duplication. Specific and relevant are actually duplicated here. And perhaps measurable and achievable is duplicated. So they're a great acronym, but I think if you think in terms of quality, quantity, and time, then you'll have good indicators. Have a quality indicator, have a quantity, and have a time. And I think you'll be fine. And if you do that, then you'll avoid the problem that this man has here, where he has inept indicators, and we don't want them. Okay, coming up to our last few questions. Very easy answers, A, B, C, or D, a baseline. Excellent. We've got some C's coming in. Very good. Okay, we all know that. A baseline is a situation at the beginning of the project. Here's a slide to illustrate that. Supposing we were going to measure knowledge levels before and after the workshop. So we've got knowledge level on the y-axis, and we're going to ask about designing a theory of change. And supposing you measured the knowledge, if you only measured the knowledge after the workshop, you're not going to know if people's knowledge has increased. If you measure it before and after, the before is the baseline and the after is the knowledge level. And in this case, the workshop hasn't worked. So not an indicator won't always, you're not always going to be successful. What's wrong with this theory of change? You're going to have to just put it in the chat or shout it out. What do you think is wrong with this theory of change?
Hi, I'm sorry. Should I have a question. Should I ask it now or at the end of the recap?
Excellent. Let's ask it at the end of the recap, just so that I know that. Thank you, Lucia. Yeah. So what do you think? What do people think is wrong with this theory of change? change. Thank you. Very good. Everyone is so on the ball this morning. This is a good wake up. Even if you haven't had any coffee, your brains are working. Yes. So output 3 doesn't have an activity, and that's really crucial. Excellent. So these are our final questions then. True or false? You should only choose indicators at the end of your project. False, 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 false. Excellent. Because you need to design your project. You need to have methods for your indicators right from the beginning, right? So your indicators should be designed at the beginning, so you're going to measure them as you go along. Population size of the hairy hog is a quantitative indicator. True or false? True. Thank you, David. David's getting in really quick. You've got a fast tap there. Excellent. True. Final question. True or false? Okay, you don't have to answer that one. Great. Okay, so I'm going to stop share there. And we've got an exercise we're going to go to next, but Lucia had a question, and I'm happy for you to ask it now.
Thanks. Yeah, I was wondering about, sometimes that you're designing a project, there's a problem, but you don't have a baseline for certain indicators. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I thought, is it not inappropriate to set a target for like a reduction or an increase in something that you don't have a baseline for? Or is it just, finger in the air? We might achieve this much and this is our target. Yeah, I thought this is a difficult question to ask because, yeah, what are you basing your target on if you don't even, or even sometimes you have a baseline, but then how do you decide that this much might be achieved by end of project or by who knows when?
Yeah. I think that's a good question. And actually, I think you could also think about it in your exercise as well. I mean, I think the most important thing is, what is your target? And is it the right target, and is it achievable? And you're going to be using all of your knowledge and your stakeholders' knowledge for that. And then you're going to defend it. You're going to say, we want this target to be like this because we know that would be a good conservation outcome. So we don't just want to, just to increase our forest area by 1 hectare. That's just not enough for conservation. So we've thought of what is a big enough change we want to see, and we're going to defend that. And then you could say, well, if you have a baseline, you're going to say, well, we know, at the moment our baseline or our current situation is poaching is, too much. We know there are, 100 snares a month being found. That's just too much. We need to reduce that. You may not have the data. You just may have the knowledge. Your forest guards might have told you. There might be a report that was written 3 years ago. So that baseline doesn't have to be quite so hard and fast as I've said. And of course, the important thing is you're defending your choice. You're saying, I think that's a big enough increase or a big enough decrease in my project. Of course, you could measure a baseline once you've started your project. The first thing you could do is measure. But I think it's important not to get too hung up. We've got few resources. If you really are sure about your target, then and you've got enough knowledge for your baseline, you might not put it in. But you need to give the context. So when if you're writing your project, you would still give the context. You'd say that, the expert opinion is that the poaching is this amount, or, that kind of thing. Because you must have had an idea of why you want your target to be this size in the first place. You wouldn't have plucked it out of thin air. You'd have said, we think it's achievable and it'll be a good enough change that we'll be on the way to helping that species recover. Does that make sense? We're going to have some time for questions and answers later, but the good thing about that question is I think it really does feed into our exercise because you're going to be talking about indicators and target. And David, I've seen your question and I'm going to answer that when we've done after our exercise, but it's a good question. and I'm going to do that after the exercise, because the exercise is talking about indicators and targets, and it might clarify some things. So I'm going to hand over to Kev.
Awesome. Thanks very much. And nice questions. So just briefly, we do have a little activity that we're going to jump into, but just pre that activity, I was just going to give some general feedback about the task, the optional task that people submitted to us. So thanks very much. I think we got 12, so about 50% managed to complete a theory of change, which gave us a chance to add some comments, and we've sent those comments back to you. However, feel free to submit them from now onwards if you're still doing your homework. So a little bit of general feedback is what we saw is that in the theory of change, we kind of teach you to think backwards from your long-term impact. So that's the big vision at the end, and you're going all the way back, and you go through those steps, and you end up with your activities. And it's a really minor point, but just have your arrows going from your activities to the long-term impact. Because if you're showing this to someone who's not familiar with sort of the theory of change and the process, it just shows that you're having an activity, and those arrows lead to that end result, as opposed to us thinking, teaching you go from left to right, but your arrows go from right to left, and your arrows go from left to right. Hope that makes sense. It's possible that you could have one output that has several activities that feed into it. So don't be scared of using multiple arrows to show how things link up. Your short-term impacts. Now, these are the measurable change that your project's going to achieve. And again, we're going to look at this within our little activity, and it's probably going to come up with some of the questions, but it's the measurable activity that your project is going to achieve within that time scale of your project. And then also with your short-term impacts, just double check that the activities and the outputs actually lead to that, and you haven't missed out any steps. So it's that logical process. One point about the long-term impact. This is the end goal. This is the big picture, the vision at the end. So your long-term impact is going to happen several years after the end of your project. And a few people have sort of tried to complete their long-term impact within the scope of their project, but then in theory, that's your short-term impact, and you'll have a bigger long-term impact afterwards. So the long-term impact is outside of the time scale of your actual project. And just one point to remember, your theory of change is a really useful tool to show and sort of persuade a funder to get into supporting your project, because you're using this logical process, and you're thinking about the end and all of these steps. It just helps you and to show them that you're fully organized. You've thought about this, you've considered everything, you know how these things link up, and all of your steps are in place. So it's just a really good thing to bear in mind. So it's a good thing to show stakeholders and get them on board with your project. So that's a little bit of general feedback about what we saw from those who submitted. So thanks very much. So this kind of leads into, and if anyone's got any more questions and about the feedback that they've received, we've got a little Q&A later on. But I think for the moment, what we're going to do is we're going to jump into an activity. Now, the activity that we've got organized is going to be utilizing Jamboards, which I'll explain in a bit. So what we've done is we have, and I'll show you this, we've got a generic theory of change, and we would like you to come up with some indicators for the outputs and the short-term impacts. So what we'd like you to do is jump in there, and just to remind you, a indicator needs to be smart. So an indicator is the thing that you're measuring, and sort of the target within that is what you're going to measure. So for example, if you're doing sort of a reforestation type project, an indicator could be something like you're measuring 500 hectares of forest that is restored. So you want something that you can actually measure. That's your indicator. And you have those for your outputs and your short-term impacts. So, and we dipped into that within some of the teaching material within the last module. So although we asked you to do the theory, so it's part of the theory of change. So if I just show you what we've got organized, and I'll talk you through the process of how to use Jamboards, because I appreciate not everyone has used this. So we want you to jump into this activity with a group and be able to complete it nicely. So if I share my screen and I'll send you a link. I won't send a link just yet. I'll explain it first. I've got everyone's full concentration. Then I'll put the link into the chat and you can jump in here. So this is Google Jamboards. And it's a nice way of showing diagrams. It's just like a basic sort of design platform. So here we've got a theory of change for Save the Pangolin. Here we've got the activities, the outputs, and the impacts. Now, what we would like you to do is come up with an indicator for an output and then a short-term impact. So we'd like you to work across. So we're going to give you 20 minutes for this activity. And then once you've done one, you can move on and do some others, but we'd just like you to think across that process of a row first. And then once the activity is completed, we'll bring you back into the lobby and we'll go through each group, and each group will feedback on one indicator. Unfortunately, we're time limited. So just tell us one indicator and then any other things we can bring up in the Q&A at the end. So each group, you'll jump into groups and you'll be, each room will have a number. And in the top right here, I've got a number, room 1. So as you can see here on the screen, when you jump into the Jamboard, you want to find your room. So if you're in room 2, here is an arrow at the top.
Come and sit here.
If you press the right arrow, you will move across and you can find room 2, room 3, room 4. So each room finds their relevant room number. Now you can annotate this because I thought this might be a useful thing to capture your thoughts. And I can also save it afterwards and share with the whole group for each person, for each group. So you can put in sticky notes. So you've got a little panel at the side here. So these are all sticky notes. So you could, for your, let's say we were doing an indicator for the output here, I might want to put in a sticky note, and these are quite useful. So this is my indicator. So you just click it. You can choose different colors. You write what your indicator is and you save it and then press cancel, and that pops up here. Now I can move that and I can put my indicator for this output just there. And if I wanted to do the short-term impact for the next one, if I click sticky note again, maybe I want a blue one, you click that. Write whatever your smart indicator is. If I can spell it right, you save it, press cancel, so I don't want to make any more, and you move it across. And now I've done my row. Once you've done one row with your nice smart indicators, you can then do some more. But you've got 20 minutes, and then we'll bring you back into the lobby and you'll report back on one smart indicator for an output or a short-term impact, and just explain to us why you think it's a good indicator, so that we can just share a little bit about indicators. I hope that makes sense. Does anyone have any questions about how to use Jamboards before we assign you into groups?
Do you have to go onto a link on Google?
You do. So I have got a link. Let me just, oh, it just went off.
These people don't know.
So I've got a link that I've put into everyone in the meeting. So here's the Jamboard link, and this will give you full editing rights once you get in there, so that you can actually edit what's going on, and then we can save it afterwards. So if you click that link, once you've been assigned into your breakout rooms, and then you'll know who's going to be finding, because you're trying to find the Jamboard number of your room number. So that's the link, and Greg is going to send you into breakout rooms, I think. So any more questions? So the link's there. Any more questions about how to use a Jamboard? And you will have 20 minutes, and then you'll feedback on one indicator that you think is the right indicator for that output or short-term activity.
So do we do the whole row, the whole line, or only one?
You can do as much as you'd like in your time limit. So you've got 20 minutes. So I would suggest, if I really liked what was going on here, I want to do an indicator for this output, and I want to do an indicator for this short-term impact. And then you've got something that relates to each other. Now, if you've done them and it's only taken you 10 minutes, feel free to do some more. But we don't normally have indicators for activities or long-term impact. So it's mainly you're showing how you're going to measure your output and how we can measure this short-term impact.
Okay, thanks.
So just think across one row first. I mean, you've got 20 minutes. This again, you know, this is a chance to meet other people. So, you know, say hi, make a little connection, introduce yourself if you haven't met the other person before, and then jump into the task. And I'll give you a halfway warning and a 5-minute warning, and then let you know when you're coming back into the room. But like I said, as we're time limited, you'll only be telling us one, but you'll have thought through this process anyway. So everyone's sort of learning as they go along together. But we'll just share one, each group will share one indicator so that we can keep on time. Fantastic. Okay. I think, Greg, send everyone off into a breakout room. Just remember, find your breakout room and then look for your Jamboard of that number. And you'll have 20 minutes. Good luck, everybody. You're going to love Jamboards. Thanks very much, everyone. So we're looking for one person from each group to feedback about why they chose one of their indicators. We'll just have a couple of minutes for each group. We'll start with group 1. And if I share the Jamboard, and I can send you this later as well. So we're looking for, let me find room 1. A volunteer for room 1, and just talk us through one of your indicators, please.
Oh, hi. Yeah. So I think a lot of people wrote it on our board.
Well, I'm getting quite a bit of feedback there. Do you have a fire alarm going off?
Frederick?
Well, I'm sorry. I think we may have the connection's not so brilliant there. Should we try again? Group 1?
Hi, Nanchin, do you want to present our indicators? Or
Yeah, I think you should go ahead. My internet is not stable here. I don't want to be break out. Yeah.
Well, for the first row, we had for the first output by end of year 2, 50% of bred and rescued pangolins released into the wild. Yeah. So we were wondering if there should be a distinction between like how many, or the time when they're bred and rescued and then the time when they're ready for release. But then we decided not. I don't know what I should say really.
Well, you've got that indicator is appropriate for what we've put. So this is quite a generic theory of change. I mean, your theories of change will all be quite unique and as detailed as you think necessary. And this is sort of the bigger picture that will, you know, back up a lot of writing and documentation that you have about your projects. But yeah, it seems appropriate because you've got a time in there and you've got the percentage. You could always use a number.
Mm-hmm.
So it's yeah, for what we've given you for this task, I think that's quite a nice little indicator. Rosie, do you have anything to add there?
No, I suggest we hear from everyone else, and then I'll make some comments. For me, I'll make the comments at the end.
Cool.
But yeah.
All right, then we'll go through group to group.
So then for the impact, short-term impact, we had by end of project, population size in such area increased by 50%.
Okay, fantastic. Right, we'll move on to group 2, Sherry. Who is in room 2? Any volunteer, please? Talk us through one of your indicators.
Yeah, for the short-term impact, like reduced poaching and persecution of pangolins, we've put Number of pangolins being poached and persecuted reduced from 50 to less than 10 by the end of the year.
Okay.
2021. And then for anti-poaching strategy, on the output, the number of poachers that are encountered in the park reduced by 70% by the end of 2021.
Okay, thank you very much, group 2. Moving on to room 3. A volunteer from room 3 to talk us through one of your indicators, please. Greg, can you give us a reminder? Anyone from group 3? Room 3?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, so one of the indicators that we put was on the short-term impact leading to the long-term impact. We said that the number of bred and rescued pangolin into the wild by the end of the second year. So increase in pangolin population, the indicator to it will be the number of bred or rescued pangolin that are released by the end of the second year. And then, yeah, and then that one we found it there, but then it's the percentage of rescued pangolins that are successfully released into the wild was also an indicator for the output on pangolins bred and rescued.
Awesome. Thanks very much. 2 nice indicators there.
And so just to jump in, I think the indicator is nice for the number of rescued pangolins released, but for your target, you'd want to know what that number is. So what is your view of what success looks like? So the indicator is good because it's the number of pangolins, but you'd want to know the target. How many do you think is a good number? You don't need to answer because I know it's not your project, it's a pangolin project, but I'm just jumping in there. So Kev, back to you.
Awesome, thanks. Yep, so you just need that quantified. So next group, jumping into room 4. So our final group, who's in room 4? Volunteer.
Yes, group 4, we attempted to look at 2 outputs, but I think in the interest of time, I don't represent on 1 output, which is the breeding and rescue for release. So we thought that the indicator for the output is that 50% of the rescued pangolins successfully released in the wild. And then on the short-term impact, we want 80% of those that we release to be breeding within 3 years so as to increase the population of the pangolins. I thought, Rara, would you want to talk about the second output?
I think for now we'll stick with what we've got here. We'll just give you a little bit of feedback. You want to jump in with some feedback about what people have come up with the indicators there, Rosie?
I thought they were great, especially because we gave you a project that we knew you weren't working on. So I think what you've heard, I think most people seem to follow the similar kind of idea. So the idea that you need to know what success is going to look like. So your indicator does need a target because you need to know what you think is a good, is it a 50% increase or whatever. So do have a number because then you're going to know what success you think looks like. And I like the progression from an output to an impact. If I take the last one from Charles was, so the output is you've got 50% of the rescued pangolins successfully released. And then of course the impact is, well, what happens next? Just releasing them isn't enough, is it? What if they all die? So your next measure is going to be, well, it's that pathway to success. So in Charles's case, your group 4, you've said, well, 80% of those released, you want to be breeding by the end of 3 years. And that sort of is a really nice sort of measure of actual success, because they're not only have they been released, they're not only surviving, they're actually breeding, and you've put a number on it, and you had a time limit as well. I thought all of your other indicators were also good. And a quick note on, a lot of you did fix on percentages, and percentages are often a good kind of thing to think of because you think, well, what percentage would be a good success rate? I mean, you know, we can't release all our pangolins, or we don't expect all of them to breed. So if you do put a percentage on, it's okay, but sometimes you need a context to that. So the context has to be, for example, 50% of rescued pangolins, for example. What is 50%? What if you only had 2 rescued pangolins? Then 50% is 1. So you've only put 1 into the wild. So sometimes it's good to add a context. Percentages are useful, but sometimes it's good to say, you could put in brackets. I mean, in this case, you wouldn't know. You don't know this project, but you might put in brackets, this means, you know, 80 or something. It's a bit like if I did a livelihood project and I said 50% of my communities improve their livelihoods, or my community members, but what if I'm only looking at 2 people? So 50% of 2 people is only 1. So percentages are good because they kind of give you an idea of the sort of scale of the change you're going for, but sometimes it's good to put a number on as well to give us an idea of what that context is. That's my quick feedback. Any back to you, Kev?
I can't really add much more on top of what you said there. So no, interesting indicators, and it's just, yeah, as a refresher to try and come up with something measurable to for your outputs and your short-term impacts.
So Kev, do you think we should now open it up to questions from you about not just this exercise, but anything that we've done so far, particularly the last module? We always give you time to ask specific questions or general questions, particularly relating to your own project. So perhaps this is a good time to now open it wider. I know we've gone over a little bit time-wise, so if anyone does have to rush off, please ask your question first. But while you're thinking of your question, I'll ask Lara to ask her question. How's the going, Lara?
Right, it's passed.
Good.
The joy of South Africa. Yeah, 1 minute on the next. We were looking at indicators and targets and short-term impacts, but often when you're writing funding proposals, like your indicators actually sound more interesting than your actual short-term outcomes, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so I just interested on, would you put just your indicators in, because they always have goals, objectives, and blah blah.
Yeah, I think that when you get to the stage of maybe writing a project or explaining it, sometimes I think it's about communication. So if you're telling somebody who doesn't know anything about your project, then you probably need to put more context in. A bit like I was saying, how, if you say 50%, what does that mean in terms of numbers? And I think sometimes, I know some funders like Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund require you to write your short-term impact in a quantitative way. So you put the measure in the short-term impact, like I did for David's example earlier on. But other people don't. So other people might write a short-term impact. So it's exciting, it's interesting, it's a change in conservation. And then they'll say, and here are our targets. So the way you've described your impact doesn't include the measurable targets, but you then have to say later on sort of what they are. So I think it's about communication. And I think it's also about being utterly realistic, because one of the problems of us as NGOs, we're writing log frames, which you'll do later. We're rather kind of forced into making, we have to making everything measurable, and that's fine. But actually, it has to be realistic. It has to be meaningful, and we can't just think of numbers just because we've been asked to. So I think there's a balance between the two there, and I think you said more interesting. I think we should make our short-term impact really interesting, and people have got to see that vision we have, that even within our 3 years, we are going to bring about a change, and we know how we're going to show we've made that change. And the way we're going to show we've made that change is to measure it somehow. It can be qualitative, it can be quantitative, but we're going to have some kind of measure on it. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah.
I mean, what's interesting, isn't it? I think, it's about communication, and there's absolutely no one strict answer. It's not like physics where there's one equation that you can't change. That, there's different ways of doing it. And I think you have to know how to how to justify why you've said it in that way and justify what your short-term impact is.
I do have another question.
Okay, well, why don't I put a pause on that while we ask other people? And actually, while we're pausing, I'd like to jump back to I can't remember when we did last at our Zoom, but I know I think it was Vela who asked a question about looking at drivers and threats, and how that we're often trying to tackle the two. Do you remember that question, Vela? Okay, she's gone quiet. I'll answer it later then. Okay, so do other people have a question? You can please also put it in the chat box. Sometimes you want to put your question in the chat box because it kind of makes more sense, so you want to make it clear. So please write a question in the chat or put your hand up. Okay, Lara, you get your second question while everyone's thinking of theirs. Go for it.
Okay, so obviously, so we work on a catchment basis as well as on a species basis. And it's really difficult to produce indicators on a catchment basis. So, I mean, alleviating poverty is like one of those linkages. Improve natural resource management is another linkage. But you see, like, the catchment level, it gets very messy. You know, so when we're doing species or putting wetlands under protection or whatever, it's, you know, it's easy to do those. But I'm sort of new into the social community work, and it often leaves me a little bit conflunked, for want of a better word.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think, well, when you said catchment level, I thought you also meant you were going to look at sort of water parameters at the whole catchment level. But I think, so taking your alleviate poverty, I mean, I think it's a goal for, you know, it's an underlying, you know, poverty is often the underlying driver. It goes back to what Vela's question was earlier, which was, you know, sometimes if we wanted to really solve, if you like, conservation in an area, perhaps if you solve the sort of poverty issue, then a lot of other things would then come out of that. Although it might not. I mean, would biodiversity be any better even if you alleviate poverty? That's another question. But because you've said your aim, if you like, or your mission is to alleviate poverty, then you're right. You would want to measure that, and I think that. There are different ways you can do that. I mean, you could literally say, well, unpack it and say, well, what is it currently? What do I mean by poverty? Am I talking about well-being? Am I talking about income? Am I talking about well-being that you measure in terms of income, or well-being in terms you measure of quality of life? If you mean alleviate poverty in terms of actual amount of money that people are living on, then you would say to yourself, well, what am I tackling? Am I going to therefore say, I'm going to introduce, alternative livelihoods, and those are going to, perhaps some of them are going to be bringing in income, in which case I'm going to have to measure that. So I think often you have to unpack that a lot, because saying alleviate poverty has so much underneath it, and you have to unpack it and then say, and often the alleviate poverty ends up being the long-term impact. It really is a long-term thing. And your short-term impact, you've unpacked it, and perhaps you've said, perhaps it is that you want to introduce income generating activities, and so therefore you're going to say, well, what income do I think that is possible to do? And of course, having those as both activities and indicators have to involve the communities you're working with. They have to be sort of designed with them, because it's got to be what is socially relevant for them and what will work for them. So I agree, it's a big thing, and I think sometimes people use it as a shorthand, and it has to be unpacked a lot more. And you could have a whole theory of change just for the poverty alleviation part, and that would be a way of really unpacking it.
So at the moment we've broken it down into spring protection, and then we have enterprises, and then we have well, I don't know whether we should do, so we also do food security, obviously since COVID, like we work in rural communities. So, but I think that sort of goes into enterprises and livelihoods really. But we'd started a new strategy called Health and Environment, and that links the springs and the water, and then to the cranes and the water, and sort of brings, so it's almost like educating people then on water and drawing them into the species in relation to it, but it's quite.
Yeah, I think, sorry, I'm interrupting slightly because I know there's a question, another question, but I still think that perhaps, so I hear what you're saying, so you've unpacked it a little bit, but I actually still think a theory of change, or, you know, theory of change in its lightest form, call it mind mapping or whatever, to really understand, to really unpack that, so you know what you should be doing, what your activities should be doing, because you want to make sure you haven't made a leap of faith. For example, if it's educating about water, what really will that result in? Or do you need other things like incentives? You've got food security, which is, you know, again, technically is a long-term impact, isn't it? That's a massive thing, but you could unpack it and say, well, what is the current situation and how could you make, what is the problem? What I think, yeah, you need to go back also, what's the problem you're solving? Within food security, what's the problem? And therefore, what should I be doing? Because I mean, you'll have the answers because it's your project, but I do think that it needs unpacking more. And I think it probably needs its own mini theory of change to get all those building blocks along the way. And also to avoid the leap of faith that if we educate, then things will happen. I mean, or if you are going to do enterprises, you know, what does that mean? And what training perhaps people need? Do they need, have you done a market analysis? Do we know there's a market for these enterprises? So, sorry, I'm moving on. Lucia, so yeah, so you've asked, how would you be able to say how much more income the community members might earn because the alternative livelihood has not been engaged in before? And I think that's a really good point. And it's a bit like I said earlier, that sometimes we very much feel pressurized to put numbers on everything, which is kind of important because we still want to know, what does success look like? But I mean, I think, yeah, with working with community members and livelihoods, I mean, first of all, you need to go right, you know, obviously you're going to co-designed it with them. You're going to understand what currently are their livelihoods and what alternative livelihoods might they be interested in, or, you know, what are they suggesting they want to do? And I think, I know I mentioned income and it's of course measurable, but there's livelihoods are more than just income. And it might be that it goes back to having a wider variety of food, or more, it might be more resilience, because if you have, you know, resilience to drought or to flooding. So there's lots of, again, I think I would unpack that more into my mini theory of change. And what do I mean by livelihood? It's quite a large topic. And with my alternative livelihood, why am I introducing it? Is it just about income, or is it about variety of food? And if it is about income, then again, I mean, it's about, I agree with you, it's a new project. So on the one hand, you don't know how much income you might earn. On the other hand, you need to know what will success look like? How will I know it's working? So you'll need to have some idea. And of course, there's often other livelihood projects that are very locally and culturally relevant that you could learn from. But I do agree that these are areas where we have to really think carefully about what, you know, how do we get our target and make sure it goes back to being smart. Is it not about being measurable, but is it realistic and relevant? Is it the right thing I should be measuring? We are now just after 11 in my time zone. This has been really interesting, and I've really enjoyed the questions you've asked. Does anyone else have any other questions? Of course, you can always, I'll hand over to Kevin in a minute and he'll tell you how you could still ask us. I know we've given feedback on all of the theory of changes that you put in. So, and as you know, Kev reported back on them, well done. I thought they were really good. I thought there was really interesting theory of changes there, and I think they were all really good. Again, if you want any further questions on them, we're always here to answer them. I think I'll hand back to Kev now. Oh, John,
just
sorry,
one,
John.
one quick question from John.
Yeah, John, you have a question.
Thank you. Just a question about outputs. I suppose outputs is a result of activities, and outputs are actually the amount of work done. And so I kind of understood that the impact then would be the result of the work done. For example, if I have my output as the number of sensitization meetings done, then I'm going to look at the impact as the attitude of communities, the change in attitude, because that should then point into the indicator. This arises from the exercise that we did previously, where I kind of saw that the attitude, Rosie kind of indicated that the attitude should be the impact, but I thought, I mean the attitude should be the output, which I thought is not right. I thought that the yes. So I just needed a clarification on that.
Yeah, no, that's a really brilliant question, and I know exactly what you're meaning. The way I look at it is sometimes I think we need to let's not try and box ourselves in too much. So we have the thing at the top that goes activity, output, impact. Forget that for now. Let's just think of the steps that need to happen for my final change to happen. And I think the sensitization workshops or education is a really good example where actually there's more than one step happens, isn't there? So you can do it. Why are you doing a workshop? Because you want maybe to sensitize people or do some education. Why do you want to do that? Because you're hoping to change attitudes. But why do you want to change the attitudes? Because you're hoping to change behavior. So you actually almost you're going to have two outputs as steps along the way. If you've got a big project, your short-term impact will be some kind of change. So you'll want to see what are people doing as a result of this change in attitude. Are they doing less poaching? Are they doing a different kind of farming? So if I was going for an ambitious project, my conservation change, my short-term impact would be something about a reduction in poaching or conservation farming or something like that. And everything along the way is going to hit that. So that's why with how you've just suggested it, John, I just wouldn't have one output and going straight to one short-term impact. That output has to go to another one and then another one. And so that you get that short-term impact. So in other words, my output, I might say, would be my result. My activity could be a workshop, and my output would be 20 community members demonstrate new knowledge or have changed in attitude. And that I'd write as my output. And then my short-term impact would be, as a result of that, there's less poaching or less tree encroachment or whatever. Do you see what I'm saying? So there's no right or wrong answer about what is an output and what is a short-term impact. It depends on the size and scope of your project. But if your project really says, I want to stop that poaching and I'm going to measure it within my project, then everything else will fall from that. And that means you'll have, it'll be your outputs that are then leading to that impact. But if I was having a big project, I wouldn't stop at saying my short-term impact is change in attitude. If I was having an ambitious conservation project, I'd say as a result of the attitude change, people are doing conservation farming or something, or there's less poaching. Does that make sense? I think John's internet is not so good. While John's internet's connecting, yeah, Laura, absolutely agree. That's why I mentioned earlier about culture. I mean, it's often not appropriate to ask about income, but it's certainly appropriate, culturally appropriate, to involve the communities you're working with in your project, in how you're going to work together, what you're going to be doing together. So I meant that very much it's got to be engaged engagement with them, and it's got to come from them as opposed to a sort of more top-down thing. But yes, absolutely in many places you wouldn't ask about income; it's considered rude. So how would you find other ways to measure? I mean, I think we could talk about this for another hour. It's absolutely fascinating, but there are other ways you can measure it. I mean, people have, there are ways of measuring it. There's observational methods, there's market methods, there's various other ways that you can get that information. But as I said, there's often that it may not be appropriate to, in a project, necessarily to go straight for income anyway. It could be, as I said, production of it could be product productions, or understanding from a community how often they go hungry versus how often they don't go hungry. There's all sorts of other ways of getting at it. Okay. If John, we haven't got back to, John hasn't got back to us yet. I'm hoping my answer helped him. And as I said to everyone, that this is where I'm reminding ourselves that we like to put nice boxes into our theory of change or into a log frame, which you're going to do next. And it's a way of communicating. A log frame, certainly, which you'll do next, does put things into boxes, but a theory of change does allow you to have intermediate steps, so that you don't jump from one thing straight to another. Make those intermediate steps and then decide how you deal with them. You could then put them into their own box. So you could put a box around these small intermediate steps. But the most important thing is to make sure that everything links one to the other, and that you know what you think your view of success is, of conservation success you want to see. Okay, Kev, over to you.
Awesome, thanks so much. And yeah, it's amazing. I mean, the more we learn, it's just more and more questions. But as Rosie mentioned, we could talk about these things for ages. And just really appreciating everyone's time in joining our Zoom sessions and interacting with the Moodle. So thanks very much. So as Rosie mentioned, the next module is logical frameworks and monitoring and evaluation. So we'll open that up after this Zoom. Again, there's another optional task within there for you to submit next Tuesday, and we'll try and give you feedback by that in time for the Zoom. So make note of any questions that arise as you go through the Moodle or with the task that we've set. And feel free to use the WhatsApp group again, just to stay in touch and say hello, or any thoughts you have, and any technical issues with Moodle, just send me an email. It looks like everything's going fantastically so far. So thanks so much from all of us here. Really nice to see you all today, and wishing you all a fantastic day. I think we'll close the meeting now, but thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a wonderful day. Stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nice to see you all.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.